Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at the Canadian Express entry system, specifically for those of you hoping to make the move to Canada in the STEM transport or agriculture field. I bet a lot of you out there listening are already pretty familiar with Canada's points-based immigration system. But we've got some fresh insights here from a recent video by Canada Immigration, and it reveals some really significant shifts that are happening, particularly in 2024. When it comes to which applicants are being prioritized by the system.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The express entry system is getting incredibly strategic. And one of the most interesting things we're seeing is this huge emphasis on the Canadian experience class, or the CEC as it's commonly known.
Okay, so tell me more about this CEC takeover.
Yeah.
Expiring post-graduation work permits seem like they're a big factor here. What's the connection?
You're spot on. During the pandemic, a lot of international graduates got extensions on those permits. And so now fast forward to 2024. Those extensions are starting to run out. We're talking about potentially 26,000 skilled workers, most of them in Q3 of 2024, who could be facing an uncertain future. Canada really wants to hold on to this talent pool. And it makes sense. These folks already have Canadian work experience. They're integrated into the system already.
Yeah, so it seems like this focus on CEC is a way to streamline the process for those who are already in Canada, help them transition to permanent residency. So I guess if you're already working in Canada on a PGWP, probably feeling pretty good about your chances right now.
Absolutely. But you know what's so fascinating is that this focus on CEC has some pretty significant ripple effects. It's actually led to a pause on those industry-specific draws that we've seen in the past for STEM transport and agriculture.
Wait, really? I mean, those have always been considered key sectors for Canada. What could have prompted this kind of sudden shift?
Well, remember how I said the express entry system is becoming more strategic? It seems like IRCC, the Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada, has really decided to prioritize retaining that talent that's already here in Canada over bringing in new people from overseas. It's created this bottleneck situation. And in fact, we know from internal notes obtained through access to information requests that there are no dedicated draws for these sectors planned for 2024.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal for anyone who is hoping to immigrate to Canada in those fields. So if the focus is shifting away from STEM transport and agriculture, for now at least, which sectors are getting the attention?
We're seeing a lot of activity in healthcare trades and categories for Francophone immigrants. This aligns with some of Canada's most immediate needs, an aging population, major infrastructure projects, and also this desire to reach that target of 7% Francophone newcomers.
Okay, so this raises a crucial question for our listeners out there. Does this shift in priorities align with your own skills and your long-term plans for Canada? If not, don't worry. It might just mean that you need to consider some alternative pathways.
Exactly, and one option you might want to look into are the provincial nominee programs or the PNPs.
Right, the PNPs. These are programs run by individual provinces that allow them to nominate people for permanent residency based on their own specific economic and labor market needs. So even if the federal express entry system isn't currently prioritizing your sector, a province might be.
Precisely. A great example is the Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program, or the OINP. They've historically had a real soft spot for tech-focused draws, often independent of whatever IRCC is doing at the federal level.
That's great to know. So even though there's this pause at the federal level, there are still provinces that are actively seeking out talent in specific sectors.
Yes, but even the OIMP has shown that. They're not afraid to change directions based on the needs of the province. And they've recently shifted their focus to other occupations as well. It's a good reminder that these programs are dynamic. You need to stay informed about their specific requirements and priorities.
So it sounds like flexibility and research are key here. You might need to think outside the box a little, explore different provinces, see where your skills are most in demand.
Absolutely. And speaking of exploring options, it's worth keeping an eye on what's happening. In provinces like Alberta and British Columbia, they both have their own active PNPs. With unique draws, that might just be the perfect fit for you.
Now, I know we're talking about the present and the near future, but I'm curious about the long game. Any thoughts on what might happen in 2025 and beyond?
Well, the 2025 immigration levels plan is still under wraps. But if I had to speculate, I'd say this trend of prioritizing in Canada applicants and those with Canadian experience is likely to continue. It just makes sense from a talent retention standpoint and also from a fraud prevention standpoint.
Right, and there's also the whole issue of potential reforms that Minister Mark Miller has hinted at.
That's right. He's mentioned things like stricter job offer checks and possible changes to how labor market impact assessments, or LMIAs, factor into the point system.
So what do you think those changes could mean for someone applying through the express entry system in the future?
Well, we're still waiting on the specifics. But those stricter job offer checks could mean a slower processing time as applications are scrutinized more carefully. But on the other hand, it could also lead to a more transparent and secure system in the long run, which ultimately benefits everyone.
And when it comes to LMIAs, we really don't know yet whether they'll become more or less important, right?
Exactly. We'll have to wait and see how the points system is adjusted. But one thing is for sure, the Canadian immigration landscape is constantly changing. You really have to be adaptable and stay informed if you want to navigate the system successfully.
Okay, that's a lot of great information to digest. But before we move on to other pathways to immigration, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about Canada's shifting definition of a skilled worker. What does that actually mean for someone hoping to make Canada their home?
That's a great question. It's a complex topic, and I think it's one that we should spend some time unpacking. Why don't we take a quick break and then come back and dive into that in more detail?
Sounds good to me. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were talking about how Canada's definition of a skilled worker is evolving. What are some of the factors driving this shift? And what does it mean for potential immigrants?
Oh, it's a fascinating topic, really. You know, in the past, the focus was often on very specific technical skills and qualifications. But now we're seeing this broader perspective emerge.
So it's not just about having a degree or a certain number of years of experience in a particular field.
Exactly. It's becoming more about the ability to adapt, to learn new things quickly, to think critically, to solve problems creatively. These are the qualities that employers are really looking for in this rapidly changing job market.
So you're saying soft skills are becoming just as important as hard skills?
Absolutely, and it makes sense when you think about it. Technology is constantly evolving, industries are transforming. Employers need people who can keep up with those changes. They need people who can collaborate effectively, communicate clearly, think outside the box.
I see what you mean. So while a STEM degree might get your foot in the door, it's those intangible qualities that will really determine your success in the Canadian job market.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about economic factors either. Canada also has social and cultural goals that influence its immigration policies.
Like what?
Well, diversity and inclusion are becoming increasingly important. Canada wants to attract people from a variety of backgrounds and cultures, and that means valuing skills and experiences that go beyond traditional academic credentials.
So things like language proficiency, intercultural competence, adaptability to new environments, those would all be considered valuable assets.
Absolutely. These are all qualities that contribute to a strong and vibrant society. And for those of you specifically interested in STEM, transport, or agriculture, think about how these skills apply to your fields. The ability to work on diverse teams, to communicate complex ideas clearly, to adapt to new technologies. These are all essential for success.
Okay, so we talked about how the definition of a skilled worker is changing. But what does that mean practically? For someone going through the immigration process, how can they demonstrate these qualities?
Well, first and foremost, it's about being aware of these shifting priorities. Don't just focus on highlighting your technical skills. Think about how your experiences, both professional and personal, have helped you develop those adaptable problem-solving qualities that Canadian employers are looking for.
So, for example, if you've led a team project, volunteered in your community, or even traveled to different countries, those experiences demonstrate adaptability and intercultural competence.
Exactly. Those are all valuable experiences that can help you stand out from the crowd. And remember, it's not just about what you say on paper, it's about how you present yourself throughout the entire immigration process.
Right. So even during interviews or networking events, it's important to showcase those soft skills and highlight your ability to adapt and learn new things.
Precisely. And for those of you in STEM, transport, or agriculture, think about how your specific skills and experiences align with Canada's broader economic and social goals. How can you contribute to innovation, sustainability, or diversity in these fields?
That's a great point. It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Right.
And demonstrating how you can be a valuable asset to Canadian society.
Well,
Now, we've talked a lot about the express entry system, but I know there are other pathways to immigration as well.
yes, and one pathway that we haven't talked about in detail yet are employer-sponsored programs. These can be a great option for those in high-demand fields, especially if you're looking for a more direct route to permanent residency.
I was hoping you'd bring those up. They seem particularly relevant for our listeners.
Yeah.
In STEM, transport, and agriculture. Given the pause on those targeted draws in the express entry system, can you tell us a bit more about how employer-sponsored programs work.
Sure. Essentially, these programs allow Canadian employers to hire foreign workers for jobs that they haven't been able to fill locally. It involves a process where the employer needs to prove to the government that they've made a genuine effort to find a Canadian worker, but haven't been successful. This is typically done through something called a market impact assessment, or an LMIA.
So the LMIA is basically a way to ensure that Canadian workers aren't being overlooked for job opportunities. But once an employer gets the LMIA, they can then offer the position to a foreign worker.
Exactly. And here's the great part. If you get a job offer that's supported by an LMIA, it can significantly boost your chances in the express entry system, even if there aren't specific draws for your sector. Having a job offer in hand shows that you're already in demand in Canada, and that makes you a much more attractive candidate.
So it's almost like a fast-track option.
In a way, yes. It demonstrates that you're not just looking for any job in Canada. You've already got a specific opportunity lined up, which reduces the risk for the government.
Okay, so this sounds promising, but I imagine it's not always easy to find a Canadian employer. Who's willing to go through that whole LMIA process? Where do you even begin to look for these opportunities?
That's a good question. Networking is definitely key. Attend industry events, connect with Canadian companies online. Use platforms like LinkedIn to your advantage. Research companies in your field. See if they have a history of hiring foreign workers.
So basically be proactive.
Oh,
And don't be afraid to reach out to potential employers directly.
exactly. And don't limit yourself to big cities either. Smaller towns and rural communities often have even greater need for skilled workers, and they might be more open to sponsoring foreign talent.
This is starting to sound like a real possibility. But let's be realistic. There must be some challenges involved in going down this route. What are some of the things that people should be aware of?
Well, as you mentioned, finding an employer willing to sponsor you can be a challenge. The LMIA process can be time-consuming and costly for employers, so you need to find companies that are truly committed to hiring foreign talent.
And even if you do find that dream job offer, the immigration process itself still takes time and paperwork.
Absolutely. Patience is definitely a virtue when it comes to Canadian immigration. And it's important to be prepared for potential setbacks or delays.
Right, you can't just expect everything to happen overnight.
Another thing to be aware of is the potential for exploitation. Unfortunately, there are some unscrupulous employers out there who might try to take advantage of foreign workers.
That's terrible. How can people protect themselves from that?
It's really important to do your research. Thoroughly investigate any company that offers you a job. Make sure you understand your rights as a worker in Canada, and don't be afraid to ask questions. If something feels off, it probably is.
So trust your gut, and don't be afraid to walk away from a situation that doesn't feel right. Are there any resources available for people who need help navigating this process?
Absolutely. Organizations like the Immigrant Services Society of BC or the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants can provide guidance and support to newcomers. They can help you understand your rights, connect you with reputable employers, and advocate on your behalf if you encounter any problems.
Those sound like invaluable resources. So we've talked about PMPs and employer-sponsored programs. Are there any other alternative pathways worth exploring?
Well, if you're an entrepreneur with a groundbreaking idea, the Startup Visa program might be worth looking into. It's designed to attract innovative entrepreneurs who can create jobs and contribute to the Canadian economy.
Ooh, the Canadian dream. But I imagine that's a whole other deep dive for another time.
It definitely is. We could spend hours unpacking the nuances of each immigration pathway. But I think the key takeaway here is that there are options, even when the express entry system seems like a closed door.
That's right. It's all about being resourceful, exploring every nook and cranny, and finding the path that best aligns with your unique skills and goals.
And remember, Canada's immigration system is always evolving. What might seem impossible today could be a reality tomorrow. Stay informed, be adaptable, and never give up on your Canadian dream.
So inspiring. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in terms of alternative pathways to Canadian immigration. But let's circle back to the express entry system and those potential reforms that Minister Miller has hinted at. Can you give us a little more insight into what those changes might look like and how they could impact our listeners?
Sure, let's break it down. One of the key areas Minister Miller has talked about is stricter checks on job offers. It's likely a response to concerns about fraudulent job offers being used to gain entry into Canada.
So it sounds like the government is trying to make sure that the system is fair and transparent and that only genuine job offers are being used to support immigration applications. What kind of changes might we see in practice?
Well, we could see more rigorous verification of job details, salaries, even site visits, to ensure that the positions are legitimate and that the working conditions meet Canadian standards. This could potentially slow down the processing time for applications as they're scrutinized more carefully. But it could also create a more robust and trustworthy system in the long run.
Okay, so it's a trade-off between speed and security. It makes sense that they want to weed out any fraudulent activity. But what about those potential changes to the LMIA point system? This is one that has me a bit confused.
It's definitely a complex issue. Right now, an LMIA-backed job offer gives you a significant points boost in the express entry pool. But there's been some debate about whether the system is truly reflecting the needs of the Canadian labor market.
So are they saying the LMIAs are losing their power?
Not necessarily. It's more about refining how they factor in to the overall points calculation. Remember, the goal is to attract immigrants who will thrive in Canada, not just fill immediate gaps. They want to make sure that the points system is aligned with long-term economic and labor market projections.
So instead of just awarding points for having an LMIA, they might look more closely at the specific skills being sought, how those skills align with future job growth, and maybe even the region where the job is located.
Exactly. It's about getting more granular.
Yeah.
And making sure that the point system is truly reflecting the value that each applicant brings to Canada.
Okay, I'm starting to see the logic here. It's about attracting the right people for the right jobs in the right places. And this is where it gets really interesting. For our listeners in STEM transport and agriculture, if you're in a field that's constantly evolving, your skills might be in higher demand in certain provinces or even specific cities.
Precisely. So staying informed about those micro-level trends becomes crucial. Don't just chase the points. Chase the opportunities where your skills are most valued.
So knowledge is power, adaptability is key. And a pinch of strategic thinking goes a long way. But with all these changes swirling around, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Any advice for our listeners who are trying to make sense of it all?
First and foremost, don't panic. Change can be daunting, but it also brings new possibilities. The key is to stay informed, engage with reputable sources, and remember that your journey is unique.
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to Canadian immigration.
And don't be afraid to seek professional guidance. Immigration consultants can be incredibly helpful in navigating these complex waters. They can help you understand your options, develop a personalized strategy, and make sure you're presenting yourself in the best possible light.
Think of them as your Sherpas, guiding you through the treacherous mountain passes of Canadian immigration.
I love that analogy. Ultimately, it's about taking control of your journey and being proactive.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Before we wrap up part 2, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the evolving definition of a skilled worker in Canada. What does that mean in this ever-changing landscape? What kind of Canada are we building?
That's a profound question, and one that deserves careful consideration. It seems Canada is moving towards a more selective, strategic, and arguably competitive immigration system, one that prioritizes long-term integration and economic contribution.
It's about finding the best fit, both for Canada and for the individual. And as we've seen, the definition of best fit is constantly being redefined.
Precisely. So as you embark on your own immigration journey, remember that it's not just about checking boxes or chasing points. It's about understanding your value, your aspirations, and how those align with Canada's vision for the future.
Beautifully said. And remember, this is an ongoing conversation. We want to hear your thoughts on these shifts, the challenges you're facing, and the questions you're grappling with. Connect with us on social media, share your stories, and let's navigate this ever-changing landscape together.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about immigrating to Canada, it's about becoming part of the Canadian story. And that story is still being written.
That's a wrap on part 2 of this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deeper. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We spent this episode looking at the Canadian Express entry system and how it's changing, particularly for those of you in STEM, transport, and agriculture. We talked about PMPs and employer-sponsored programs as alternatives. But let's wrap things up by zooming in on those policy changes Minister Mark Miller keeps hinting at.
Yeah, those upcoming reforms are definitely worth paying attention to. It's a bit like trying to predict the weather. You can look at the patterns, but there's always some uncertainty.
Well, let's try to put on our forecasting hats and see what we can figure out. One of the big things Minister Miller has mentioned is stricter checks on job offers. What do you think that means for express entry applicants?
Well, it seems like it's a response to concerns about whether some of those job offers being used to support applications are actually legitimate. The goal is to make sure the system is fair, transparent, and only genuine offers are being used.
So basically, more due diligence. How would that actually work in practice?
We might see things like more rigorous checks on the job details, salaries, maybe even site visits to make sure the jobs are real and the working conditions meet Canadian standards. It's possible that could slow down processing times at first, as applications get looked at more carefully.
Okay, so it's a trade-off then between speed and security. It makes sense they'd want to weed out any fraudulent activity, even if it takes a bit longer. Now, what about those potential changes to the LMIA points system? That one's got me a little confused.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex issue. Right now, if you have an LMIA-backed job offer, you get a big points boost in the express entry pool. But there's been some debate about if that's always the best way to measure how valuable a candidate could be to Canada over the long term.
So are they saying that LMIAs are going to become less important?
Not really. It's more about fine-tuning how they fit into the overall points calculation. Remember, the goal is to attract immigrants who will really thrive in Canada, contribute to the economy and society, not just fill a temporary need.
So instead of just getting points for having an LMIA, they might look more closely at what specific skills the employer needs, how well those skills match up with long-term predictions for the job market, and maybe even which part of Canada the job is in.
Exactly. It's about being more precise and making sure the points system really reflects the value that each applicant brings to Canada.
Okay, I'm starting to understand the logic here. It's about attracting the right people for the right jobs in the right places. And that's where it gets really interesting for our listeners, especially those in STEM transport and agriculture.
Right, because those sectors are often tied to specific locations, or the skills are in really high demand in certain provinces or even cities.
Exactly. So staying informed about those local trends is even more important. Don't just chase after the points, chase after the opportunities where your skills are actually valued and needed.
Absolutely.
It's about finding that sweet spot where your skills and goals match up perfectly with what Canada needs to grow. But all these potential changes can feel overwhelming. What advice would you give our listeners who are trying to make sense of it all?
First of all, don't panic. Change can be scary, but it also brings new opportunities. The key is to stay informed. Make sure you're getting info from reliable sources, and remember that everyone's journey is unique.
That's right. There's no one right way to immigrate to Canada.
And don't be afraid to ask for professional help. Immigration consultants can be incredibly useful. They can help you figure out your options, come up with a plan that works for you, and make sure you're showing off your best side.
It's like having a guide to lead you through the mountains of Canadian immigration.
Uh-huh. I like that analogy. In the end, it's about taking charge of your journey and being proactive.
We've talked about a lot today, but before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to something you mentioned earlier about how the idea of a skilled worker is changing in Canada. What does that mean as we move forward? What kind of Canada are we building?
That's a really thought-provoking question. It seems like Canada is becoming more selective, more strategic, and you could even say more competitive when it comes to immigration. They're focused on long-term success and contribution to the economy.
It's not enough to just get into Canada anymore. You need the skills and qualities that'll help you do well and make a real contribution to Canadian society.
Absolutely. And we've seen the definition of what it takes to succeed in Canada is always changing. Adaptability, critical thinking, and that willingness to keep learning new things are more important than ever.
You have to be proactive, stay informed, and always be ready to learn and grow.
Exactly. And remember, you're not on this journey alone. There are lots of resources out there to help you every step of the way. From immigration consultants to settlement agencies to online groups where newcomers share their stories and advice.
Don't hesitate to reach out for help when you need it. So as we finish up this episode, I want to leave you with this thought. Your journey to Canada is your own. There's no one right path.
Embrace the challenges, celebrate the successes, and never give up on your dreams.
That's a great way to end it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Canadian Express entry system. We hope you learned something new. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deeper.